Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I'm going to take this thing off of here. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody understand me? I don't know if Frank made any arrangements for a translator or not, but after Dr. Fowler there, you may have a little bit of a different accent here. But I bring you greetings from Tennessee, and it is a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a long, long time. Number one, to come to your beautiful city. I love Philadelphia, and coming here, I've come here to do research and, of course, toured around and so on. So I've been looking forward to coming back, and especially because of the venue. I mean, how did y'all pull this off? This is absolutely amazing. It's probably the coolest venue I've ever spoken at. It's really amazing. So I commend you. In fact, I was in Milwaukee just a couple of months ago at their round table, and they're very proud of their venue, which is actually the Billy Mitchell home. And you know Billy Mitchell, the air power enthusiast and all of that, and really just ornate place and all that. They're really proud of it. So I was bragging on it, how beautiful it was, and one of the most beautiful places I've ever spoken and so on. And I told them, I said, just in a couple of months you're going to be surpassed though, because I'm going to the USS New Jersey and speaking at a symposium on the battleship. So I'm excited about being here. I'm a sucker for old ships like this and so on. So thank you for having me up. In your program, it does say something about the builders of the initial ironclads and construction of those, and I will talk a little bit about that. Gary, my friend from Louisiana, you're going to have some more southern accent here in just a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more, I think, about that and put it in the context of the other ironclads, but I'm going to deal with just very early in the Civil War and the dealings on the western waters, the river warfare, or the Brown Water Navy, and concentrating on the battles of Fort Henry and Donelson, primarily Fort Henry. How many of you have been to Tennessee? How many of you have been to Fort Donelson, the national park there? Okay. How many of you have been to Fort Henry? Okay. Did you go underwater in your scuba gear? It is, it's under the Tennessee River. The TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, dammed up the river in the 1930s, 1940s. That, of course, raised the water up above the fort, and so nobody has seen Fort Henry since the 1940s. There are some outer works that you probably visited and so on. So how many has been to Fort Henry and Fort Donelson? There you go, just a few. How many of you just flat don't care? You just came for the battleship, didn't you? All right, so we're going to talk about Grant Invades Tennessee and talking a little bit about the early naval operations and some of the ships and so on. And so I brought mainly maps and photos up here. We'll go through these as we go along, and I brought my handy-dandy pointer. Can everybody see my red pointer there? Carry this thing around. I have it for two purposes. Number one is for when I go speak and use PowerPoint, and I'll use it to point things out on the map. The other reason I use that is that we have ourselves a legitimately crazy cat at home who will not follow directions. She'll sit there and she knows exactly what you want her to do, and she will not do it. And she likes to get out of the garage and all of that, and you can't get her back in, but she's a sucker for this thing. She just follows it all over the place. So that's my two uses for that. So let's talk about the early 1862 river warfare and the battles. And if we move forward, give you just a little bit of a map of the operational area. And of course, you see the major rivers, the Mississippi coming down through this area to the Gulf, New Orleans, of course. You see its tributaries, the Ohio River, the more important river systems to this talk. And of course, Gary later will talk about the Red River and all of that. But the tributaries of the Ohio River, the Cumberland River, making a bowl right here into Tennessee, as well as the Tennessee River, which makes a much deeper, larger bowl. The headwaters of both are right up in this area in the mountains, of course. The Tennessee will make this deep dip down into northern Alabama and then flow northward through western Tennessee into the Ohio, which of course will eventually go into the Mississippi River. The Tennessee is the major river in terms of the early operations, naval operations. And of course, it's more than just Tennessee. It starts in Tennessee, of course, but it does dip down into Alabama. You all football folks up here, who's the big team around here? Penn State, Temple. Does Temple have a good football program? Of course, Tennessee, University of Tennessee Volunteers. We got a Tennessee fan here. Their arch enemy, one of their arch enemies, is the University of Alabama. Got any Roll Tide folks around here? There's one. The Tennessee folks are so into it with the Alabama folks that they say we don't even like our river to flow through Alabama. But it does, and it makes that big deal. Now, the way the geography takes place here, and the way it all works out, is that rivers actually become really more important in terms of the early operations in the Civil War, and particularly out west, than do the vaunted railroads. Oftentimes we hear about the railroads. The Civil War is the first modern war in history, in American history, and all that. And I've been asked about that, and I have a little bit of a problem with declaring something as the first modern war. Is the Civil War the first modern war? Well, if you take into account that this is the first major war fought after the Industrial Revolution with the use of steam powers, with the locomotives, with steamships and all that. You get a little bit of that in the Mexican War, but this is the first major war to involve all those. So maybe, yes, this is, in those terms, the first modern war, but if you're looking at the larger context of this, there are no nuclear weapons, there are no machine guns, there are no battleships such as this. So is this really the first modern war? I think it's a relative term, and the goalposts keep moving in terms of modernity. So yes, at that time it was the most modern war, but it's been eclipsed, so I'm not sure we can say it's the actual first modern war. However, it is the first major American war where we utilize railroads. There are no major railroads that are utilized in the Mexican War. In the Mexican War, you utilize some steamboats and getting the troops to Veracruz and so on. But once you move inland, there's no real utilization of steamboats there. So the Civil War is the first modern war in that sense. And so we have, particularly out west, you have the major railroads and you have the rivers. And in between the two, I would say that the rivers are vastly more important than the railroads, although the railroads get all the attention. And you talk about Sherman's movement to Atlanta along the railroad, and you talk about all the other operations along the railroads and so on. But it dawned on me one day, in looking at the context of the Western theater, if you take the Confederate line, and I should have put this on here, that's why I've got the cat's toy here, but if you move along the Confederate line from the vast Gibraltar at Columbus, Kentucky, over to Forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, Columbus being on the Mississippi River, and then you move to Bowling Green, Howard Sidney Johnston's headquarters, and then you move over to the mountains around the Cumberland Gap and so on. There's about a 400-mile Confederate defensive line along this border, roughly, of Tennessee and Kentucky. Along that Confederate defensive line, you have, in terms of railroads and rivers, you only have one railroad that crosses that defensive line. That is the Louisville and Nashville Railroad that runs from Louisville down through Bowling Green to Nashville. All other railroads do not cross this Confederate defensive line. The Mobile and Ohio, the major trunk line from Mobile up to Columbus, will terminate at Columbus. Others, these railroads will run immediately in rear of the Confederate line. So there is only one railroad that actually crosses the Confederate defensive line and thereby poses a problem for the Confederates in their defense. However, at the same time, there are three major rivers that will cross this Confederate defensive line. One is the Mississippi at Columbus, one is the Tennessee at Fort Henry, and the third, of course, is the Cumberland River at Fort Donelson. So three major rivers will cross this Confederate defensive line early in the Civil War, while only one major railroad will. So in that sense, it already seems that the Navy might be a little more important to operations than the rail lines, right? So that gives us a little idea of the Navy. And the Union forces, the Union High Command, will very quickly realize this, and they start a program almost immediately of developing an inland Navy force, or a brown water Navy. And it's not something that you can just do overnight, of course. It takes a little bit of planning to do. You already have the blue water Navy, not a lot to it, but you have the blue water Navy, which will be augmented by the monitors and others. At times, some of these ocean-going ships, like the Hartford and Farragut and so on, will come up as far as Vicksburg, of course, in the Mississippi River. But primarily, we have to invent, if you will, and build a brown water Navy in order to operate on these rivers out west. And so the planners get together, and Gary, I think, will talk more about Samuel Cook, who is the designer of these ironclads, James B. Eads, who actually builds the ironclads. There are other ships, however, that are predecessors to these famous ironclads. Anybody been to Vicksburg and have seen the Cairo? That's one of the city-class ironclads. Very famous, probably the most famous of the gunboats in the West, because it's on display now. But there are others that will actually precede these. And I've given you just in our show here, and Gary's going to give you a whole lot more pictures and so on, but the first three vessels that are actually put into service are what are called timberclads. They are not ironclads, they're timberclads, covered with timber, obviously. And there are three of these that will really do a lot of service early in the war and even later on. This is a photo, I believe, of the USS Lexington, which, if you're familiar with Shiloh, you're familiar with the Lexington and the Tyler that fire up Dale Branch Ravine and fire throughout the night, and so on. So these are wooden ships, not going to repel many cannonballs, if any. To understand it, I'm no naval historian per se. I'm a Civil War or military historian, but not naval historian per se. But I believe the wooden bulwarks are more for small arms fire to protect the cannoneers and the crew and so on. But there are three of these timberclads: the Lexington and the Tyler and the Conestoga, which will operate on these western waters throughout the fall and winter of 1861 and 1862. They will eventually be augmented by a couple of ironclads that are a little bit ahead of the city class ironclads, and these are basically converted ironclads that were formerly snag boats and other type of vessels. The Essex, that is pictured here, as well as the Memphis, will be converted into ironclads. And then, of course, you get the famous 7-boat series, the City Class series, and they're the famous poop turtles, as they are known, the ironclads. And I've got a list of them here. I never remember them off the top of my head. The Cairo, which is now at Vicksburg, of course. The Mound City, the St. Louis, which later became known as the Baron de Kalb, and is in the Yazoo River at this point. It was also sunk just south of Yazoo City, Mississippi. The Cincinnati, Carondelet, the Pittsburgh, and the Louisville, obviously all named after cities on the Ohio and the Mississippi River. So this is, I believe, the Louisville, if I remember correctly. So you can see a little bit of difference in what they look like here. The timberclads, the converted Essex there, and then one of the city class ironclads. So very quickly, the federal forces begin to build these, and again, it's not something that can just be done overnight. Although it is remarkable how quickly these city-class ironclads are built. The contracts were led, I believe, in August of 1861. They are expected to be delivered in October. And, of course, the old tale is that when the contracts are signed, the trees are still growing in the forest. And they have to build them, and I don't know whether that's actually true or not, but that's what they say to illustrate how quickly these things go. Well, they're not in commission by October. All are actually commissioned and ready by January of 1862, which is still remarkable when you think you're building ships this big and this complex. To have them in service then by January of 1862. Now, not all are ready to actually go into service in January of 1862. The ships are pretty much ready, but there are a couple of different problems. One is armament. It takes a little while to get the armament from the arsenals and so on, but that's not the major problem. I know what the major problem for the outfitting and sending these early vessels into action is? Crews. You don't have the men, because the Blue Water Navy is recruiting as well, and they're paying money for you to come join and so on. So everybody's going to the Blue Water Navy. You can make more money actually as a civilian pilot or a civilian crew member on a riverboat than you can in the Navy as well. So they have a lot of difficulty actually crewing these vessels. And as they go into action then, in February of 1862, not all are actually ready. In fact, when the Federal forces begin to approach Fort Henry, only 3 of these city-class ironclads are included, 3 of the 7. The Essex goes along with 3 timberclads, but only 3 of the 7 simply because they don't have the crews to man each of the ships. Now, certainly you don't want to go into action with half a crew, right? You just assume you can send everybody on one side to shoot all those guns and then send everybody to the other side to shoot all those guns. It's not going to work out very well. You have to have a full crew. And crew complement on a city-class ironclad, 70 something, is that 72? That number sticks in my mind a little bit. So they didn't have the full crews, so what they did, of course, was to cannibalize the crews. And you would take crews off of a different vessel and put them on the gunboats and send them full crew into action. As we'll talk about in just a little bit, when we get to Fort Henry, several of these gunboats are shot up pretty good and have to return to Cairo in order to be repaired. And so by the time Grant will continue on to Fort Donelson just a week or so later, they're looking for gunboats. So what do? Well, you've got good gunboats that haven't been damaged, but they have no crew because you took the crew off of these gunboats to send to the other boats. So what do? Well, you take them off the damaged gunboats and send them to a whole new gunboat, which, you kind of, any Navy folks here, you kind of get attached to your ship a little bit, don't you? And you're all of a sudden told, all right, you're not going to be stationed on the Pittsburgh anymore. We're moving you over to the Louisville, and I don't want to leave my ship. And there's some desertions over this as well. One of the coolest things I've found. You ever do research at the National Archives? It's amazing what all they have there. It is absolutely amazing. It's the biggest headache to get in there and get it done because they have full times and you can't get your material. You walk into the Library of Congress, the manuscripts room, and you fill out a little card what you want, you hand it to them, they go get it for you, and they bring it right out to you. But the National Archives, you have to wait for a certain full time, so you turn in your records at a certain time, and you may be an hour and a half later before you get your records. So what do? Well, you go walk out on Pennsylvania Avenue, walk up and down the streets, and looking for something to do. And President Wright, I saw Bill Clinton one time when he was in a motorcade, and he was sitting there waving out the window. You could tell that little long nose, tell it was him just as plain as day. But you have to wait for your time there. The other problem is, I don't think they actually know what all they have there. I think they have more material than they actually know. And I figured out the secret to the National Archives, that if you get a good archivist, you talk to one of the archivists that knows what they're doing, and most of them do, but if you kind of build them up a little bit and kind of play the reverse, what do you call it, the reverse psychology or whatever, and say, I think you have this, but I don't think you can find it. It's like a light in a fuse, I'm going to find this. I'm going to find it. One day I did that with some legislative stuff. I used to do a whole lot on the preservation of the national parks and dealing with those records and so on, talking to the legislative folks, and it got to the point that he was determined to find something, and he said, come on, go with me. And we went up in like the catacombs of the National Archives building there on Pennsylvania Avenue, And it's just, you know, we would walk by this big stash of stuff on pallets, you know. He'd say, oh yeah, that's the Ted Kennedy papers. We just hadn't got to process it yet, you know. We would walk by something, it was just amazing what all they had. So I don't think they actually know what all they have. But long story short, I don't know why I got off on all that, but one of the coolest things I found in the National Archives were not necessarily the logbooks. I looked for the logbooks for these city class vessels. Have you ever run into the logbooks or anything? Found them at the National Archives? Okay, well, see, I didn't find them. They didn't know exactly where they were. Some of this is printed in the official records, the naval official records. But I did find the muster books, where you look at, say, the Pittsburgh, and you go through the basic muster rolls for these vessels, and in February of 1862, it'll say, transfer to Carondelet, transfer to, and you can go right down to the specific names that were transferred, like 20 or 30 or 40 off of each boat onto different boats. So that kind of just makes it real and very interesting. So they're cannibalizing crews for these boats, and as you might well imagine, they're not terribly veteran status at this point. They're commissioned maybe in January of 1862. They're taken into action in February, early February of 1862. You know, when this ship, the New Jersey, was commissioned, I don't know the history of the New Jersey, but I'm betting when it was commissioned, put in service, it went on a shakedown cruise, probably in the Chesapeake, maybe down to the Caribbean and all that. You work the kinks out, you get the crew, and this is a little more sophisticated, obviously, than a Civil War steamboat, but you go on a shakedown cruise, you learn what you're doing and all that kind of stuff. There's no luxury for that in this time period, because the naval commander at this point, along with the Army commander at this point, are pushing their immediate superior, Henry Wager Halleck, in St. Louis, to go on the offensive. Now, Halleck is very cautious. He is not really interested in an offensive, but he is getting word from Washington that you better get on the move, and there's troops supposedly being sent to the west that you better operate before they get there. In fact, General Beauregard himself is rumored to be heading west with 18 regiments of infantry. Beauregard is indeed coming west, but with about 18 staff officers, not 18 regiments of infantry. But the idea is we better move before all of those reinforcements get here out west to reinforce the Confederates, and so it'll be a hurried up operation in early February of 1862. Now, those commanders, of course, the Army commander is Ulysses S. Grant. We don't need to talk a whole lot about him at a naval symposium. But Grant is the pusher, the mover and shaker in terms of really pushing for this movement along the Tennessee and the Cumberland River to break the Confederate defensive line, Albert Sidney Johnston's defensive line. He finds his basic naval soulmate in the naval commander, Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote, who is the son, actually, of a senator who, from Connecticut. He was born in Connecticut. His father was a senator. He wanted to go to sea very early, and always interested in the Navy and so on, so his father, of course, sent him to West Point, which, go figure. He very quickly left West Point and took an appointment as a midshipman, and his naval career blossomed thereafter. He was, I believe, a captain in charge of the Brooklyn Naval Yard at the beginning of the Civil War. And he will come west when the early leader of the naval forces in the West, a guy named Rogers, John Rogers, I believe, will be sent to other duty. He does not get along with the powers that be, John C. Fremont, Henry Halleck, and so on. And so Foote will be sent out west to take command of the naval flotilla. Very quickly, he will realize as a captain that he is not in the best position to do this, because he is getting ordered around, not to mention the fact that the Navy at that point is under the Army, under Army command. But he finds himself as the commander of the fleet of, or flotilla of gunboats. He finds himself being ordered around by Army colonels. So this colonel will come in and say, well, you're just a captain, so you go do this, you take your boat, and so on and so on. And so he writes to the Navy Department and says, look, I need flag rank if I'm going to be able to work with generals in the Army. Boot me up to flag rank, or either send me to the blockading squadron or something where my level of my status will be sure. So they boot him up to the flag officer. There's no admiral necessarily at this point. This is where you get a little higher than a commodore, it's a flag officer. And so Flag Officer Foote will be Grant's basic soulmate, and he will push Henry Halleck as well to begin operations on the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers. And in early February 1862, they will do so. We'll go back just a little bit and put the context here of, again, the Confederate defensive line from Columbus to Fort Henry and Donelson to Bowling Green to the Cumberland Gap here. The place to break the line is at its weakest point. Albert Sidney Johnston, and we're not getting into Army maneuvers and all that here, but Albert Sidney Johnston is fixated on the ends, basically, of this defensive line. He knows Columbus, Kentucky is impregnable to assault. If you've ever been to Columbus, Kentucky, it sits up on very high bluffs. He's also very concerned about Bowling Green because Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio is confronting him at Bowling Green. Pays relatively little attention to the center here, Forts Henry and Donelson, or the left center, and as a result, the Federals will hit at the weakest link, and this is where the major damage will be done. Now, we need to get into just a little bit in terms of the Confederate defense against the Union Navy. The Confederates at this point are trying to muster a defense in terms of naval forces. They are building ironclads at various areas. The closest to our area of operations here is down in Hardin County, Tennessee, where I actually live, Cerro Gordo. They are building an ironclad Eastport. And across the other areas of the Confederacy down in Mississippi and Louisiana and so on, they're also building some other ironclads. But it's very slow. The technology is just not there in the South, in the highly agricultural South, to build these ironclads the way that the North is able to do it. So the Confederates, as a result, rely on something different than naval forces to block the opposing naval forces. What do they rely on? Well, they go to fixed fortifications, which you see here at Fort Donelson, you see here at Fort Henry, we see it at Columbus, Kentucky, we see it at Island Number 10, we see it at Fort Pillow, we see it at Vicksburg, you name it, where the Confederates need to block a river. The way they do it is not by opposing naval forces, but by fixed fortifications with cannon and munitions inside those fortifications. Now, there are problems with this, of course. There are good things about it. You know, you go back in history, and how have Americans largely won major victories in our past? Fort McHenry in Boston, or in Baltimore Harbor. You get into other areas. Fixed fortifications at times do work, and we have a little bit of a fixation, if you will, on fixed fortifications, stopping the British here and there, and so on. The problem with fixed fortifications, however, is that relatively, not very often, relatively few times, do naval forces actually move forward and just bombard a fort into submission, as we see in Fort McHenry. What's the major problem with a fixed fortification? It is easily turned in a turning movement or outflanked, where you can land troops maybe out of range of the fort, march troops in rear of it, cut it off, let it wither on the vine, right? Can you say Vicksburg? Can you say Fort Donelson? Can you say Arkansas Post? Other places. These forts are taken by land forces rather than naval forces. The major threat is opposing the land forces. And that's why the Army and the Navy are working together here in doing this. And the major surrenders, of course, particularly out west, Fort Donelson, Arkansas Post, Island Number 10, Vicksburg, all have the same formula, basically. that federal forces march in rear, and this necessitates building earthworks and so on. You see the outer fortifications of Fort Donelson here. You have to build fortifications on the land to defend the fort blocking the river. So it becomes very, very tedious there. And it largely never works. So, as we get into fortifications, and particularly Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, with these new ironclads that we heard a little bit this morning about, there have been experimentation with ironclads and so on in Europe, iron-covered ships and so on, but you don't see those in action until you get to North America. And the first time they actually go into action is not the Monitor and the Merrimack in March, was that March 6th, I believe, 1862, but is a month earlier in February when these ironclads go into action at Fort Henry. Now they're not opposing, not ships, ironclads opposing each other. The first time they actually are in action will be at Fort Henry here in February. So you see the positioning of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. This is the Cumberland River flowing, if you keep on going way over here, is Nashville. This is the Tennessee River. It makes this big bowl down south into Alabama there. Fort Donelson is on the west side of the Cumberland River. Fort Henry is on the east side of the Tennessee River. That is, of course, so that they can mutually support each other. It's only about 10 or 15 miles or so across the neck of land here that runs all the way up. It's like a finger all the way running up to the Ohio River. Today that is known as the land between the lakes. Somebody been to it's National Wildlife, it's not National Park Service, it's National, whatever, fishing, wildlife, whatever, it's the recreation area, the land between the lakes. Very beautiful area. So they're mutually supporting. The problem, though, even more with Fort Henry, is that you have to put Fort Henry, obviously, on the east side of the Tennessee River, so it would be mutually supportive with Fort Donelson, right? It has to be on the east side of the river. Well, there are other constraints as to where you put Fort Henry. If you go back, mix it around a little bit here. Go back to this area, you see where Fort Henry and Fort Donelson sit here. The Kentucky-Tennessee line goes here, makes a little jog to the south, and then continues on over the Mississippi River. And I looked into this a little bit, and the best explanation I can find is that the surveyors got drunk when they got to this point and kind of got offline just a little bit. I don't know whether that's true or not. Makes a good story. At any rate, there's a little bit of a dip here. Well, you have to put Fort Henry on the east side of the river, and you have to put Fort Henry on the south side of the state line. You can't put it in Kentucky, because when Fort Henry is begun, what is Kentucky's status in the war? It is neutral. Switzerland. It tries to stay neutral, and that's part of the problem that Governor Isaac G. Harris of Tennessee runs into. Early in the war, Kentucky is neutral, and Harris says, okay, I don't have to bother with defending my northern border, because the Federals aren't going to be dumb enough to move through Kentucky and attack the northern border of Tennessee. So I'll put all my forces on the Mississippi River, the western flank here, because the Federals can't come through Missouri and cross the river, or Arkansas across the river. So the major fortifications and the major troop strengths will be on the western end of the state along the Mississippi River, because I don't have to worry about the border here. Now, obviously, no one would be stupid enough to break Kentucky neutrality, right? Well, that's most everyone. Everyone except Leonidas Polk, Confederate general who invades Kentucky, takes Columbus, of course, and that causes Kentucky eventually to stay in the Union. You know, they basically side with the Federals, and numbers-wise, I think just in a nutshell, Kentucky will send about 70% of its troops to the north and about 30% to the south. So Polk, the minister, of course, Episcopal bishop, must have been a much better preacher than he was a general, but he makes this blunder. And of course, that removes Kentucky's neutrality. Both sides are free to move into Kentucky, but Isaac G. Harris has not defended the Kentucky-Tennessee border, and all of a sudden he has to get going, and work really starts at Fort Henry and Donelson then to get it up to speed. So for that reason, to abide by Kentucky neutrality, you have to put Fort Henry south south of the Kentucky line, east of the Tennessee River, and in doing so, you restrict the good places to put a fort. And as a result, when you go to Fort Henry today, you have to go down into the Tennessee Valley, and when they dam up the river, of course, the water rises and covers the fort. Same thing then. When the Tennessee River flooded, what happened to Fort Henry? It floods. Not a good place for a fort. Normally you want your fortifications a little higher up so you can use plunging shot, particularly on these ironclads. We think of the ironclads as being completely covered with iron, like a steel battleship. Not so. The decks were wood and skylights and all that. You can shoot through the decks and see. Just the sides, and not all the sides were actually iron. So you want to put your forts a little bit higher, but there is no place within these restrictions to place Fort Henry, so you place it down as close as you can to the river, and there are problems that develop. In fact, the Confederate general that is sent to Fort Henry to take command of Fort Henry and Donelson in November of 1861, a general named Lloyd Tillman. You ever heard of Lloyd Tillman? He will get to Fort Henry and make a quick inspection. He'll look around and see the fort. Yeah, it's a pretty nice fort, but he'll look on the trees, and above the parapets, he will see different colors on the trees, watermarks. And he'll look at the fort, he'll look at the watermark. He'll look at the fort, he'll look at the watermark and say, something ain't right here. What are those? Of course, the locals will tell him, well, yeah, that's how high the river gets. Who put this fort here? Well, we had some issues here in where to put the fort. So right off the bat, Fort Henry is in a little bit of a problem spot. If we go a little bit farther, this is a more localized map. You see the Tennessee River here and the star-shaped fort with its outer works. If you've been to Fort Henry today, probably what you visited, if you saw earthworks, were these outer works. The Tennessee River, you can see the lowland, the swamps here, will come to about right here. This is the high ground. So the Fort Henry is completely underwater. There are pictures, however, of what Fort Henry used to look like, and this is an aerial shot from about 1937, as I understand it, and you can see the star fortification here in amongst the cultivated land, the Tennessee River there, and you can see the fortifications. Go back one, see the star shape. That picture would have been taken like from down here looking this direction. So if you go that photo, again you can see the star shape here. So still extant in 1937, still extant today. You just can't get to it without scuba gear and going down. I understand that there are divers. One of the major things in the Tennessee Valley is mussel diving, for mussels and so on. And there are divers, I understand it, who say, you know, we go down and you can feel parapets and so on in terms of where Fort Henry is. I've not been there for 8 months. I don't know, but the fort apparently is still there. So, how does all this play out? How does the operations begin in terms of the Navy in dealing with Fort Henry, and really what is, I think, and I will argue to you today, that it is probably the critical naval victory, certainly the critical naval victory, but one of the most critical Civil War victories in the West. Now, when you start talking about Civil War victories, everybody talks about Gettysburg and all these others. Maybe mention some of the West, Vicksburg, Shiloh. How many of you put Fort Henry right up there with the big victories? We've got one back there. We're kindred souls here. We got another here. Halfway. Gary says halfway. I think it's one of the major strategic victories that produces huge ramifications. And there are other naval victories. Memphis was a purely naval victory on June the 6th there. Item number 10, you can mention others, but in terms of actual victories that the Navy wins, and again, I'm not a naval historian per se, and I'm not necessarily a Navy partisan or an Army partisan. I kind of call it like I see it. I would probably differ with some Navy folks who argue that the Navy won Shiloh and all that. I have a hard time seeing, you know, the Navy's just major tactical importance at Shiloh. To me, the Navy really is more of a psychological aspect at Shiloh and other places. As you're moving to transportation, the transportation movement along these rivers is critical. And as you're transporting these steamboats and so on, filled with infantry regiments and artillery supplies and all that, they don't go anywhere without a gunboat escorting them. And it turns to the point where, you know, the Southerners are kind of in the fix that they got them, we don't have them, and that starts playing with your mind a little bit. So psychological, pretty important as well. So as we get to dealing with Fort Henry, however, we can talk about Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and just to kind of give you the overall, we'll go back a couple of slides here to give you just a kind of overall picture. Grant and Foote will lead their forces southward along the Tennessee River, up the Tennessee River. The river flows northward at this point. And they will land at various landings, such as Bailey's Landing here on both sides of the river. Grant will begin marching southward while Foote moves along the river on the morning of February the 6th. Grant's forces will log down. There's been a heavy rainstorm on the evening of February the 5th, and so the artillery and the infantry bogs down, leaving the Navy, of course, to breast the current and move southward. And they have their own problems. Some of these naval people talk about, like Commander Henry Walk and others, they talk about the river is just rushing, and fence rails and treetops and everything in the world's coming down against us, and the current is so rapid. But they make it, and they move down to Fort Henry, of course, bombard Fort Henry into submission in about an hour and 15 minutes. And Lloyd Tillman will surrender Fort Henry there on February 6th. We'll talk more about the actual Fort Henry importance in just a second. I'm just giving you the layout right now. Then Grant, of course, once he takes Fort Henry, will scare the wits out of his commander, Henry Halleck, up in St. Louis, when he sends a message, Fort Henry is ours, and oh, by the way, I'm going over to Fort Donelson now. And the cautious Henry Halleck basically says, hang on, wait a minute, but Grant's off and running, and all Henry Halleck can do is just send more reinforcements. So Grant eventually, he doesn't do it quite as quickly as he intended to, but eventually by the 13th or 13th actually, he will move across these two roads, Telegraph Road and the Ridge Road, will encircle Fort Donelson, where the Navy is also involved as well on Valentine's Day on February the 14th. By this point, Flag Officer Foote has gone back to Cairo, where he has moved the crews to new boats who have not been shot up at Fort Henry, has come back down the Cumberland River and will attack Fort Donelson on the 14th. And there is not a replay of Fort Henry, because Fort Henry was so low, Fort Donelson is higher, and Fort Donelson holds. Fort Donelson actually just beats the fire out of these ironclads. Some of them, they shoot their steerage, you know, the rudders and the tiller ropes and so on, shoot those away, and smokestacks and all that. And these vessels are just bobbing in the river, just spinning here. Fortunately, of course, in both the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson operations, the current will carry any wounded vessels northward away from the fight. Had they been carried southward, of course, they could have been captured if they were damaged enough. But fortunately, the river's current will carry them out of harm's way. The Navy fails on the 14th at Fort Donelson, and of course that leaves Grant to basically win the victory on land. The Confederates try to break out on the 15th, heavy land fighting in this area on the 15th, but through the questionable decisions of the three Confederate commanders, who I used to refer to as the Three Stooges, John Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Bottom Buckner. I have since revised that. There's only one Stooge actually at Fort Donelson, Miss Gideon Pillow. At any rate, the Confederates do not retreat and get out, and Grant, of course, will capture the entire garrison on February the 16th with the famous note basically to Buckner that says, I will accept no other terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. and Grant, of course, becomes U.S. Grant, unconditional surrender grant in history. So just a little bit of the overview there. As we go into Fort Henry, though, I want to concentrate on Fort Henry. Here you get a little bit of the operations in terms of Grant leaving Bailey's Landing with John A. McClernand's forces, moving down through the creeks, Panther Creek and so on. They're late to the show and do not really get into the operations. C.F. Smith, along with Lew Wallace, will be moving over to a support fortification on higher ground on the other side of the river, Fort Highland, but it has no artillery, no nothing. In fact, the garrison has been collision alarm. The garrison has been brought over to Fort Henry, and the Fort Henry garrison then has been sent away to Fort Donelson. So on the morning of February the 6th, this major naval victory is won. Flag Officer Foote is very religious. He, in fact, spends the morning in prayer before he goes into battle. He has warned his commanders. He's very frugal, very conservative in a lot of different ways. He will tell his commanders, we won't do any of this, again, I'm a naval historian, what do you call it when you straddle targets? You fire low and when you fire high, you adjust your fire. None of that, just fire right into the board as best you can. He tells them don't waste shots on different things. For instance, he tells some of his commanders that each shot costs $8. So don't be wasting ammunition. And the first salvo that goes out of the flagship there toward Fort Henry, the gunners looking at it and watching. You can see cannonballs. Y'all see the cannonball going? You didn't see the cannonball. Okay. You can. These things are so slow velocity. You can see them going. You see 3 of them going toward Fort Henry, and the gunner says, "Well, there goes $24." He has ingrained this in their minds. Don't waste ammunition. And he prays about it, and of course he attacks Fort Henry there at 11 o'clock. And you see the lineup there of the different ironclads here, the Carondelet, the Essex, the St. Louis, and the, what's the other one? Cincinnati, I believe. You see the 3 timberclads in rear firing what they call curvated shot over the ironclads into Fort Henry. Now, there is some damage that Fort Henry is badly located and so on as it is. There's 17 guns in Fort Henry, and they respond, of course, and they really tear up the Carondelet. They kind of focus on the Carondelet, and it takes several shots. The major shot that does the most damage, however, hits the Essex, the non-city class ironclad, the first one really that came about. Goes through a porthole or a gun embrasure and hits the boiler. And of course, the boiler explodes and scalds just tons and tons of soldiers. And there are accounts that this happens so fast that some of the gunners in the motion are just frozen, basically in death at their positions. You know, the commander of the Essex himself, Dirty Bill Porter, will be scalded and will try to get out one of the portholes there, gun embrasures, and basically going into the river, but somebody else who had already gone out catches him as he goes, and they kind of walk around the knuckle of the ship to safety there. So it's a pretty drastic situation on the Essex. It's dead in the water, and of course it floats out of harm's way northward. It's one of the ships, of course, sent back to Cairo. But Admiral or Flag Officer Foote will continue ahead, will continue bombarding Fort Henry. Various guns in Fort Henry will burst and be knocked out of action. And after about an hour and 15 minutes or so, the flag will go up in Fort Henry to surrender. The flag will come down, and they will motion for surrender. And to show you the problems with Fort Henry, when a boat is sent from the flagship to Fort Henry, it sails through the sally port. It's already that far underwater. And of course, Lloyd Tillman will surrender Fort Henry, and that'll basically be that. Now, all that's well and good, but how important is it? Take a look at my time here. I fully understand that I'm the last thing between now and lunch. So I will finish very quickly, but I do want to talk about the ramifications of Fort Henry and explain to you and argue to you why Fort Henry is so important. Most of the time, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson are lumped together, right? But in terms of naval action, you can't lump them together because Fort Henry is as much of a victory for the Navy as it is on February the 6th. It is that much of a defeat on February the 14th. How do you get two drastically different operations? Well, you have to separate them, of course. And when you do that, you start looking at ramifications, not just of the Fort Henry and Donelson campaign, and there are many, but you look at ramifications strictly of Fort Henry. And one of those major ramifications is further naval incursion into the south. You see Fort Henry here. You see the Tennessee-Kentucky line goes up to there. You see Fort Donelson here. Well, in actuality, the goal of the naval campaign and the Army campaign as well is not necessarily Fort Henry. That's not the goal. The goal of the campaign is this railroad bridge at Danville, where the Memphis and Ohio Railroad crosses from Jackson, Tennessee, Humboldt area, across the Tennessee River, the only bridge till you get to Decatur down here in Alabama, and on to the Bowling Green area. If we go back, go all the way back, I apologize for this, to the original map, you can see it a little bit better. If this is Albert Sidney Johnston's defensive line, from Cumberland Gap to Bowling Green to Fort Henry and Fort Donelson to Columbus, if you look at the railroad layout from Bowling Green, you can move along this Memphis and Ohio Railroad, take this railroad up here to Columbus. The wings of Johnston's defensive line are connected by interior lines, by railroads, and as a result, the Confederates will use these railroads to shuttle troops back and forth. What happens if you break this bridge at Danville right here on the Tennessee River? There is not another bridge to cross the Tennessee River till you get down to here. So what happens to the two wings of Johnston's defensive line? They are now torn asunder. They're cut in two, right? And the Federals, there's nothing south of Fort Henry to defend the Tennessee River, so the Federals can range as far as they want to up and down this Tennessee River. So that's why that railroad bridge at Danville is extremely important and actually the goal of the campaign. And very quickly after Fort Henry falls, Flag Officer Foote will send a naval contingent with Rondelay and the 3 timberclads southward to break this bridge, which they do. And then the 3 timberclads, a smaller flotilla under Lieutenant Seth Ledyard Phelps, will move on down the Tennessee River, down southward, up the Tennessee River actually. They will capture the east port at Saragordo. They will continue on past Savannah and Pittsburgh Landing and all of that, into northern Mississippi, into northern Alabama, all the way to the Muscle Shoals. And if you're not betting that Confederates all over the South are watching this, newspapers in Lynchburg, Virginia, and Georgia, and New Orleans, all over the South, are reporting that there are Yankees in Alabama. This is a big deal. The naval forces have penetrated all the way to the Cotton States as a result of the fall of Fort Henry. So Fort Henry is not necessarily the most important part of this. It is the defense of the most important part. So when Fort Henry falls, let alone Fort Donelson, it allows the Federals not only to break the railroad bridge here, divide the wings of the Confederate Army, but also send federal naval units all the way down into Mississippi and Alabama, scaring the absolute wits out of the Confederates. And they know full well, if they can send naval gunboats down along these rivers, what else can they send down along these rivers? Transports with infantry regiments, armies. The invasion of the Confederacy has begun. Now, there's one more major ramification that we need to talk about in terms of the difference between Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. I'm of the opinion that even though Fort Donelson is the one that gets all the attention, I mean, there's a national park there, right? That's illustrative of importance. So there's a national park at Fort Donelson, and yes, Fort Donelson made Grant a hero. We saw at Fort Henry, the Navy won Fort Henry, not much glory there for the Army. Grant wins the glory of unconditional surrender at Fort Donelson, right? Fort Donelson dooms Nashville, Confederate capital of Tennessee, the first Confederate state capital to fall. There are huge ramifications of Fort Donelson. However, I am convinced that the larger ramifications of Fort Henry dwarf those of Fort Donelson. For instance, when you begin to look at the strategic effects of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, when you get into, for instance, the days of February the 7th, February the 8th, February the 9th, what are the Confederate commanders doing in terms of, let's go to this map, in terms of Albert Sidney Johnston that's up in Bowling Green on the east side of the Tennessee River. When Phelps goes south, he realizes there are Yankees behind us. So what do we got to do from Bowling Green? We got to get out of here, right? We got to retreat south of certainly the Cumberland River. And we better get to Nashville, because if the Federals get through Fort Donelson, there's nothing between Fort Donelson and Nashville, and we'll be cut off north of the Cumberland River. So we got to get across the Cumberland River, and then we got to get across the Tennessee River. So they hightail it down across the Tennessee River here. What happens to the forces at Columbus, Kentucky, west of the Tennessee River that are now outflanked? They begin to move southward as well. Of course, both will concentrate at Corinth, Mississippi. So the wings of the Confederate Army, with Federals now behind them, both have to retreat, and that is a result not of Fort Donelson, but of Fort Henry. Those orders are given February the 7th, February the 8th. Now, in a larger context, even more, what also begins to happen on February 7th, 8th, and 9th is that Jefferson Davis and the Confederate High Command at Richmond figures out we got to send reinforcements to this area. We've been blockading and are garrisoning every bit of the Confederacy. That ain't working. So we better call in reinforcements from Pensacola, Mobile under Braxton Bragg, from New Orleans. New Orleans is not necessarily threatened. Let's call New Orleans folks under Daniel Ruggles. Nashville Lovelace sends those up. They concentrate at Corinth. The concentration that occurs at Corinth, Mississippi in late February and early March, mid-March of 1862, that will result in the concentration and the offensive that becomes Shiloh, will occur beginning on February 7th, 8th, and 9th as a result of Fort Henry, when Fort Donelson has not even surrendered yet. Fort Donelson will surrender on the 16th. So all of this major strategic movement that occurs as a result of Fort Henry, not Fort Donelson. Well, what's Fort Donelson useful for? Well, Fort Donelson is told to hold so that we'll block those gunboats from getting to Nashville, because Johnston has to get his army south of the Cumberland River before the gunboats reach Nashville. So it's a holding pattern, basically. The damage is already done because of Fort Henry. Now, I've laid this out on a map, what I call the footprints of impact. If you look at the darker shade here, the footprint of impact of Fort Donelson, yes, follows along the Cumberland River all the way to Nashville, but it's a fairly small footprint of impact. The footprint of impact of Fort Donelson, 10 or so days earlier, reaches all the way up to Columbus, when this begins to start the process of falling back, all the way up to Bowling Green, where Albert Sidney Johnston begins the process of falling back east of the Tennessee River, down to Mobile and Pensacola, when Braxton Bragg begins to move forward, down to New Orleans, where Mansfield Lovell begins to send troops northward to Corinth. The concentration that will occur at Corinth in March is a direct result of Fort Henry, and as a result, the footprint of impact of Fort Henry is absolutely huge. But we don't hear much of Fort Henry. Why not? There's no national park there, it's underwater. But it's my argument that Fort Henry is one of the most important victories, let alone naval victories, but it is a victory won by the United States Navy in February of 1862 at the little-known fortification of Fort Henry, Tennessee. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? We've got just a minute or two for questions. Do we have any questions? One in the back.
Well, of Fort Henry, I mean, they Confederates put that program Donald, that really was one.
Well, you get into the tactical decision or the strategic decision of Albert Sidney Johnston, and basically Johnston keeps sending in more and more troops to hold Fort Donelson while he gets his contingent, his corps, out from Bowling Green. He keeps sending more and more generals, which they don't really get along, and I think Johnston's biographer, Charlie Rowland, put it best. He says Fort Donelson either has to be all or nothing. And he tried to do it halfway in the middle, and it rose up and bit him in the rear end. And it was not a smart play the way he did it. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, the question is, didn't the fall of Fort Henry cause the bastion at Columbus to fall? Yes, because the Federals were able to get below Fort Henry, south, basically outflanking Columbus, that turning movement, if you will. The orders began the process of withdrawing from Columbus, Kentucky immediately after Fort Henry. Yes, Fort Henry's the main cause. Yes. What? The cost of construction of an ironclad versus a wooden ship, I have no idea. I'm going to wait and let Gary Joyner tell you that this afternoon. Okay? Cheaper. He says cheaper. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Why did they put the fort there? Simply to block the Tennessee River. Block Union movement along the Tennessee River, to block access to that railroad bridge, to hold that railroad bridge. So there's nothing important about the site. It's kind of like Shiloh and Pittsburgh Landing. There's nothing strategically important about Pittsburgh Landing itself. In fact, Pittsburgh Landing in the Shiloh area was intended to be no more than a staging area for the movement down the Corinth, which was significant in terms of the railroads and the crossing of those railroads. Same thing here with Fort Henry. There's nothing important about Fort Henry. It's just the best place they could find at the time to block access along the Tennessee River to that railroad bridge and deeper penetration into the heartland of the Confederacy. So I see them gathering behind me. I assume that means, oh no, we've got time for another question or two. Anybody? Well, thank you very much for having me. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you very much.